Good evening and welcome to the September meeting of the Historical Society of South Australia. Thank you all for coming to hear Julie Tolley, our guest speaker this evening. I've had quite a busy week this week, and a late night with work last night and a long day today, and I left a bit after 6 and I rushed around and had something to eat, and I arrived here and I could see all these wine bottles on the table and I thought, what a great idea. I could do with that, but sadly they're all empty. So Julie, you won't be coming back again. Anyway, I'm sure each of those bottles has a story to tell, and I'm sure, Julie, you have a story to tell in your topic this evening, Women in the Wine Industry in the Barossa Valley, 1839 to 2003. So please make welcome Julie Tolley.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here. The presentation tonight is just a tiny, weeny bit of my PhD. It would sort of be a grape on the bunch in the vineyard, I guess, if you could make an analogy. And I've started with the Barossa Valley mainly because it has such a long history, and using a whole lot of primary sources and interviews, I've come across a very long history of women involved in the Barossa Valley. So that's just a little bit of background to the paper. The Barossa Valley has a long history of wine production, and women have played a significant part in its establishment and development. And this is not just at winemaker level, but in a wide range of skills and occupations. And so I've also included picking, pruning and managing a vineyard. However, this work is rarely acknowledged and often trivialised. 19th century letters, journals and diaries I examined provide evidence of the early history of women working in the wine industry of the Barossa Valley. And the interviews I held show the importance of women's contributions to the industry in more recent years. Both English and German settlers were influential in the establishment of the wine industry in the Barossa Valley. Among the 19th century German women to be discussed are Sophia Biswinkel and Johanna Fiedler, and several English settlers, including Anne Jacob and Eliza Randall. But I'll start and talk about the German settlers first. The German settlers made an important contribution to the development of the wine industry in the Barossa Valley. Unlike many of the English Protestants who were opposed to the sale and use of alcohol, the German settlers, most of whom were Lutherans, had a cultural tradition of making and drinking wine. Vines had been introduced to Silesia in the 12th century when they were cultivated mainly by religious orders and the aristocracy. By the 19th century, grapevines were commonly grown in the hills of Silesia, and it was part of their culture of the region to make wine for use in the home. While the Lutheran settlers, when the Lutheran settlers arrived in the Barossa Valley, of course they brought with them that experience and the inclination and to grow and harvest grapes, and that part of their culture came with them. German families. German settlers in the Barossa Valley carried on the tradition that all members of the family worked on the property at busy times of the year, such as shearing, ploughing, vintage, pruning and planting. Little distinction seems to have been made between men and women's work, and at peak seasons, both from the families in a village would work cooperatively. Now some of you will be familiar with Gustav Herbig, his wife Caroline and their 16 children who lived in a gum tree. Sounds very exciting, but I don't think it would have been. And they all worked together to harvest wheat. The oldest boys cut and gathered in the sheaves, and Caroline and the girls tied them. In his travels in 1884, John Bull, and I'm sure some of you would have read some of his work, observed German women shearing sheep. The shearers were principally young women without shoes and stockings, my goodness, who were waited on by the men of the village, who, when called on, caught and carried the sheep to the nearest girl. From the earliest times, it has been customary for German women to take an active part on a regular basis in the work of their family vineyards. In 1903, Ernest Whitington describes a vintage time at Chateau Tanunda. I don't know if there are any empty bottles of Chateau Tanunda. A German woman arrived with her wagon of grapes and helped to unload them. This is 1903. In this district, it is no uncommon thing to see the women pruning and working on the farms and in the vineyards like men. The employment of women in vineyards has evidently continued from the period of European settlement to the present day. Photographs and diaries that have survived among the records of family vineyards from the late 19th century attest to the presence of women in teams of vineyards. This is a photograph of the Grant family in 1898, and you can see that they are mainly women. If you look very carefully, you can see some evidence they have been picking grapes. What sorts of things can you see? How do you reckon? Yes, stained. Their pennies are stained, aren't they? So what I did was I looked very carefully at that, and I actually counted the number of women. So there's a small group of 4 people on the right, which are probably the Grant family members. Now, this is only speculation. The older woman sitting on a chair may be Mrs. Grant, while her son and daughter-in-law stand beside her and their young daughter kneels in front of them. The other people in the photograph are a little bit further apart, so they're unlikely to be family members. You know, if they were family, they would have been kind of together. It is evident from the stains on their hands and the clothing, you know, as you said, from their pinafores, that the women and girls have been picking grapes. There is a young boy who kneels next to a metal bucket, and his job is to carry the buckets filled with grapes to the cart. And one of the women I interviewed actually described this, and this is still done. And what they call out is bucket or boy when the bucket is filled. And so then the young boy brings an empty one that they fill and takes the filled one. Details of this photograph reflect the methods of transport, work practices and clothing of German wine workers in the Barossa Valley. And certainly it's an interesting social and historical context that we can look at that. This next photograph was taken around 1900 and shows grapes being harvested at Nuri Utpa. 3 women, apparently unaware of the camera, are bending to pick grapes, while a 4th stands gazing at the lens with her secateurs. In the background, a man sits holding the horse's reins, ready to move the cart which is full of grapes. Another man, whose task no doubt is to empty buckets of grapes, stands near the cart. In the foreground is a small boy, and small boys had their uses there, didn't they? Whose job is, again, to empty the buckets of grapes from the pickers and then leave an empty one. And that's how they divided the work. So that one's taken around 1900. This is another one taken around Bethany, which shows members of the Holbrook family during vintage. The 4 women depicted have been picking grapes from the trellis vine, and a boy has been carrying buckets. One man sits on the cart holding the reins, and another man who has been loading grapes stands nearby. And there are two small children. Can you see them right in the front? There's a little girl, I think, yep, and then an older child. And that was taken around 1911. This is another photograph taken around 1920 at Orlando Vineyards in Roland Flat. And it shows 4 women picking grapes, a man carrying the buckets, and another man loading grapes into the cart. So again, there's certainly the division of labour. What I'm going to do now is to describe some German women in the Barossa Valley who influenced viticulture. Johanna Fiedler was one of the earliest women to take full responsibility for a vineyard when she took over the management of the family winery and distillery at Bethany on the property that had been acquired by her father-in-law Johann Friedrich August Fiedler. The Fiedlers arrived in South Australia in 1838 on the Prince George and first settled in Klemzig. In 1843 they moved to Bethany, and Johann is considered to be the first German recorded as owning a vineyard in the Barossa Valley. In a book, The Old Colonist, are you familiar with The Old Colonist? It was edited by Yelland, but The Old Colonist was actually a person called Henry Jones who travelled around the state and made some wonderful observations in the very early days. In 1851, The Old Colonist noted that the Fiedler winery was well established and producing large quantities of excellent wine. By 1862, the Fiedler vineyard was sufficiently large for Johann to qualify as a distiller of brandy. Legislation allowed anyone with a minimum of 2 acres of vineyard to apply for a licence to use a still, so you didn't need very much to be able to do that. Johann's son Alexander was also a winemaker, and he used some of the brandy to fortify wine. Alexander died in 1875, and when his father was nearly 80 years old, the son died before, and his wife Johanna took over the management of the winery and was granted a distiller's licence in her own name. This new responsibility implies a long-standing involvement by Johanna in the family winery and suggests that she had acquired considerable skills and experience over the preceding years. The original vines are now incorporated in the Turkey Flat vineyard on Bethany Road. So that's Johanna Fiedler. There was another woman, Sophia Biswinkle, who took up the management of her family vineyard and winery when her husband died. The property, originally named Buxfeld, are any German people here? Buxfeld, had been established by Richard Schomburg, who was at the original gardens, when he purchased land on the Gawler River west of Gawler. Before Biswinkle came to Australia, he had been employed as a gardener in Potsdam and was familiar with growing vines and had a keen interest in viticulture. By 1853, he had planted 93 different cultivars using cuttings from his gardens of Potsdam and gradually earned a reputation for his good wine. However, he was appointed director of the Adelaide Botanic Gardens and could no longer maintain the property and sold his land then to Friedrich Biswinkle. George Lawyer, editor of the local newspaper, the Gawler Bunyip, visited the property in 1879, where he was given some excellent wine, and which he thought would take first place at any exhibition where good wines are appreciated. Friedrich died in 1879, and his wife Sophia took over the property, which by this time included 8 acres of vineyard containing 68 grape varieties and a 5-acre orchard of fruit trees. So just within that small plot of a vineyard was a huge number of different kinds of grapes. It may be assumed that in order to maintain and manage such a large property, Sophia had extensive experience in the family enterprise in order to keep it going. The next person I want to speak to you about is the Seppelt family. Joseph Seppelt immigrated from Silesia in 1850 with his wife Johanna Charlotte and their 3 children, Benno, Hugo and Ottilie, and settled in the Barossa Valley. Joseph's background had been in cordial and liqueur making, and he saw the potential of winemaking in the area. Vines were planted, and the first wine was made in the early 1850s in the dairy, which had been established soon after the Seppelt family settled on their land. According to Len Evans, the building at Seppeltsfield that was used for milking and also for making wine was known as Frau Seppelt's Dairy. In those days, operating a dairy was considered a woman's responsibility. Women carried out milking, along with other farm activities such as smoking bacon, rearing chickens and growing vegetables and fruit. The Seppelt women continued the rural tradition of producing dairy products. And in 1908, the author May Vivian travelled throughout South Australia. Do any of you know this book? It's really interesting. Everything is beautiful and wonderful and glorious and delightful and special. And she talks about the garden here. I'll just read a little bit out because it is very, very nice. Do you know it, Jeffrey? Sunny. Oh, have you? Yes. Yeah. Yes. Oh, she has enjoyable days at delightful places. You know, lovely fruit gardens. All these wonderful adjectives. And she talks about all the sorts of things that she did. We next walked over to a narrow building, which Mrs. Seppelt told me was her bacon curing and smokehouse, for there were 100 pigs and piglets in the clean, cosy places built for them. Well, they would be, wouldn't they? Then we looked at the fowl yard, where there were majestic-looking buff Orpingtons. I've never seen majestic chooks, but anyway, they were. And everything looked so delightfully fresh and clean. I won't go on, but she was quite impressed with that. It is interesting to note that the small-scale production of milk and milk products was responsibility of Mrs. Seppelt. But then, once the wine was made, the dairy was used for the storing of that, and the husband took control of the space in the building. Many other Germans settled in the Barossa in the late 19th century, and we can assume that most grew one or more vines and made wine for use in their homes. However, some winemaking families are still mentioned in the literature. For instance, Johanna and George Schmidt bought land at Vine Vale. Johanna and Johann Schrapel settled nearby at Bethany, and there are still relatives there. And so too did Carolina and Samuel Stiller. And descendants of all those families are still involved in the winemaking industry today. So there were many German women in the Barossa Valley who made a significant contribution to the establishment of the wine industry. But in addition to Germans, the Barossa Valley also attracted Irish and English settlers. One of the pioneers in the Roland Flat district was a young English woman, Anne Jacob, who arrived in South Australia in 1839. Anne was the only daughter of Anne and John Jacob, who owned Down Farm, a large prosperous dairy at Abbott's Anne near Andover in southeast England. When her mother died in 1834 and her father in 1836, she and her two brothers, William and John, inherited the property which they sold before migrating to South Australia. Anne left London on the Ganges in February 1839 with Robert Gouger, the Colonial Secretary of South Australia, and his second wife as fellow passengers. When Anne came to South Australia, she purchased a property near what is Gramps Vineyard and managed this with her two brothers. William was an assistant to Colonel William Light, and John was an explorer. Anne kept a diary which describes her journey out and her early years in the colony, and later wrote her reminiscences, and both these documents are now held in the State Library. And I have used Anne Jacob as an example of the sort of work that women did in those early days in winemaking of South Australia. Anne's reminiscences describe her journey out here in great detail. While the ship was berthed in Cape Town on the way to South Australia, Anne went to see and she described it as the famous Constantia vineyard. In the company of 5 single young men, she talks about going to visit the vineyard. We hired a carriage to make the rather hazardous 12-mile trip. This is 5 single young men. I hesitated, oh yeah, for a nanosecond, Anne, but was persuaded to put myself under their care and see what I could. Clearly, Anne's interest in viticulture and her curiosity about the vineyard overrode any wish to submit to social requirements of maidenly discretion. The vineyard at Constantia had been planted in 1684 by the Dutch governor Simon van der Stel and named in honour of Constance, his wife. It had an excellent reputation for good quality wines, and when planting vineyards, several early settlers, John Barton Hack and George Stevenson, used cuttings from Constantia vineyard, so it was quite famous. And obviously Anne had an interest then, which is quite curious when she was so very young and coming from a country that doesn't have a very long history of viticulture and from a dairy. So Anne arrives in Port Adelaide in June 1839. Neither of her brothers was in Adelaide. William was out surveying and John was buying cattle. She was very disappointed to find them not in Adelaide. Her journey had taken 5 months and she was eager to establish herself in the new colony. Anne stayed at North Adelaide with generous and hospitable friends of women that she had known in England. And she comments, and it's really quite an interesting list about the cost of food. Well, except for one thing. Anne comments, provisions were fairly expensive. Eggs at 6pence each, a hen cost £1, a cat 10 shillings, and a meat 1 shilling per pound. I thought, well, that's interesting that she sort of puts the cat in with all the food things. I don't know what the train of thought was when she was writing it. Using money she had inherited from her parents, Anne Jacob purchased land at Rowland Flat at the junction of Jacobs Creek and the North Para River in October 1839. The land had been surveyed by her brother William, and Johann Menger, who was living in a cave, as one does, near the junction of the rivers, had reported that the rolling hills and valley reminded him of the Rhone district and offered a good prospect for vine growing. In her diary, Anne mentions her acquaintance with Menger, and it seems likely that she discussed with him the suitability of her property for grape growing. And in fact, Menger comes quite often to the house and has meals there, and she also goes and visits him in the cave and had afternoon tea. Wonder what they had. Anne called the property Moraroo, an Aboriginal word meaning big waterhole. And this is what she says. I bought £500 into the colony and it was expended in purchasing 500 acres of land at Moraroo, being a special survey taken by Gilbert, Brown, Hallett and myself. Now it's interesting that she mentions that she did the survey, so I don't know if that's literal. Did she actually go out on a horse and, you know, ride around? I don't know, but it's a nice little picture. In earlier accounts of the origins of this important property, it has been assumed that Moraroo was purchased and a farm and vineyard established on it by William and John rather than by their sister Anne. But Anne brought money to the colony with a specific purpose of acquiring land, and the grant, finalised in 1842, shows clearly she was the sole purchaser of the tract of land she named Moraroo. And it was wonderful to find this document. I found it in the land titles office and found the original one. It was just very exciting, and I don't know if any of you have had any dealings with the people there, but they're extremely eccentric and very helpful, and they were just as excited as I was to find it. So this is the document that says that it's Anne Jacob who established the 500 acres at Moraroo. Clearly she had the necessary strength of character to collaborate with her brothers in establishing a farm in the next few years, but it also included a vineyard. Having bought the property, and remember she's still actually living at North Adelaide where provisions were expensive, food and cats, and she's very desirous of going to Moraroo. She does not mention in either her reminiscences or the diary that she had seen the land before purchasing it, but the area had been surveyed by her brother William, and she may have heard that the geologist Menger, who lived in the cave, had reported favourably about its potential for farming and particularly for grape growing. She set off with her brother John in October 1839, and they finally reached the property. And I'll quote, "Moraroo, a strange and wild place it looked to call our home." In her bullock dray, Anne had brought a plough and a variety of other farming implements, and she was greatly amused that an invoice for their purchase was addressed to A. Jacob Esquire, not imagining that such things would belong to a young lady. Anne slept in one room of a house that had been partly built, and John and the workmen slept in a tent. Living conditions were difficult, and she describes it as just better than camping out. Anne records cooking outside by an open fire and boiling salt beef and pork with damper. Now, this is October 1839 when she arrives at the property. So the diary then goes on, and again we have an entry then for Christmas Day 1839. Anne had bespoke a quarter of mutton from the nearest sheep station as a great treat, but they reconsidered the matter and did not kill. So my brothers took their guns and shot some parrots, young and old. Stewed parrots were her first Christmas dinner in South Australia. The following year, her diary entry is humorous but more positive. Christmas Day, 1840. We had roast goose for dinner, a decided improvement to parrots. Well, anything would have been. Never eaten parrot. 30 acres of land had been cleared and a mixed farm established that was large enough to necessitate the building of 3 more cottages for farmhands, and which included a large dairy where Anne made great quantities of butter and cheese. And I've read that she exported the cheese to Mauritius. Now, I find that rather curious and interesting. Why would you export cheese to Mauritius? But I think I would be getting off the track a bit from my PhD if I were to explore that, but certainly a little later. It's quite strange. But also there were oats and barley and vines and fruit tree. And during a visit to Moraroo, the old colonist observed a considerable extent of orchard and vineyard. Anne participated in the establishment of a dairy and other family enterprises at Moraroo, and when she managed the property during William's frequent absences, her responsibilities included care of the vineyard. Now, just a little bit about Anne, because she had quite an interesting life. Now, Anne married Arthur Horrocks, brother of John, who was shot by his camel. Right, okay. Now, after she married Arthur, they lived on a property at Penwortham near Clare, another wine growing area north of the Barossa Valley. Now, John, Arthur's brother, had a farm there planted with vines, which he had brought out from Europe. And after he died, he left the property to Arthur. The house, which had been completely built by 1842, was known as Hope Farm. I find that a bit sad, actually, given, you know, his awful death. And a sketch of it, done by John, shows a large, comfortable brick home with 3 chimneys, substantial windows and a wide veranda. It is likely that Anne participated in the work at Hope Farm, as she certainly had the experience and knowledge of managing a vineyard from being at Moraroo. In 1852, Arthur and a friend, Mr. Maldon, went to the Victorian gold diggings, leaving Anne to manage the property for several months. When I visited the site, I went to Penwortham, I visited the site with local historians, and they informed me that the house had been demolished in 1915 to make way for the railway line. Anne and Arthur had 5 children. Arthur died in 1872 and is buried in Main North Road Cemetery, and Anne died in 1874 at Mount Gambier and is buried there. A photograph of Anne, taken a few years before she died, shows a strong-willed and stoical woman. And this photograph was given to me by a member of the family. And I didn't quite know what to say when I saw it. I thought, well, you have to be very discreet. And these people are very kind. And I said, oh, she looks very determined. And the relatives said, oh, we thought she looked quite ugly and not very pretty. And I thought, oh, thank heavens she said that. And I said, well, she has an interesting face, doesn't she? So that's Anne Jacob. The Morroroo homestead, which can still be seen at Roland Flat, is now owned by Orlando, and the old walls of the original cellar have been incorporated into the Grant Burge winery nearby. Anne Jacob was one of the earliest settlers in the colony, and like many other women who have worked to produce wine in South Australia, her significant contribution to the development of the wine industry is frequently overlooked. In particular, her part in establishing the now internationally famous Jacobs Creek vineyard has never been acknowledged. So I think she's an interesting example of many women, and I think there is something to be said that we have many records because she had 2 brothers, William and John, who were famous, and because she married Arthur, brother of John. But there must have been many, many women who contributed to the fantastic viticulture of the Barossa Valley. Now, there were other significant women too. Anna Brown was another woman. She married the English vigneron Joseph Gilbert, and her brothers gave her a vineyard as a wedding present. Useful when your husband's a vigneron, isn't it? But unfortunately, it is now under the water of the South Para Reservoir. Eliza Burge was the daughter of John Springback, who was a well-respected vigneron, and when Eliza married, she helped in the vineyard too. Another woman, Elizabeth Foote, was given some land, and that's quite interesting because her brother gave the land to her, but because she was married, she wasn't legally entitled to retain ownership. So I'm not sure why that occurred. But that also had an extensive vineyard, and described by our good friend the old colonist, in 1851. It was customary for women to care for cultivated areas adjacent to the houses. So with these houses, it's likely that they managed the vineyard and the fruit trees as well. Eliza Randall is another woman. Eliza and David arrived in South Australia on the Templar in 1845, and she visits several vineyards. They took up 2,000 acres of land near Williamstown, and she also had a vineyard there. Mary Smith, wife of Samuel Smith, in the Yalumba, managed the property while Samuel and his eldest son Sydney went to the goldfields. Mary had 5 daughters with ages ranging from 2 to 13 years, and they went off for 4 months to the vineyards, and she managed the property while they were away. So he must have had some confidence in her to be able to do that. So the many English women in the early years of development were women like Anna Brown, Eliza Burge, Elizabeth Foote, Anna Gilbert, Anne Jacob, Eliza Randall and Mary Smith. The German women included Johanna Fiedler, Sophia Biswinkle and Johanna Seppelt, all of them establishing and maintaining vineyards in the very early days of colonial settlement. So to finish up, the Barossa Valley has a long tradition of winemaking, and many women have been involved in the industry from its beginning. Photographs, diaries and interviews provide this evidence. As wives of grape growers, women were expected to pick grapes at harvest time, prune vines and provide meals to the workers in the vineyard. Childbearing and rearing were a large part of a married woman's life, as well as maintaining the home, carrying out religious and moral responsibilities, visiting sick relatives and performing other social obligations, all of which constituted their primary duties. Most of that they all did before lunch. In the Barossa Valley, as elsewhere in wine growing areas of South Australia, women have undertaken additional work outside the home, either to bring income to the family or to reduce labour costs by their participation in work on the property. Women have a long history of contributing to the wine industry, as they have in other rural activities, but the extent and significance of their contribution has never been fully acknowledged. But I'm hoping in a small way that some of the research I have done and tonight will help overcome that. Thank you very much. Was the wine that produced just for local consumption or statewide? In the very early days, and what was your name? John. John, no, my understanding for the German people was that it was mainly for their home or for friends, and at that point it was just a very local consumption. I didn't go into the bigger commercial ones, but Gramp was probably one of the earliest commercial ones, and he had, you know, hundreds and hundreds of acres. The smaller family ones were just enough for themselves or for family celebrations. Yes. A van, no. And, you know, we had that famous bike race here, the Jacobs Tour Down Under. I want to change it to the Anne Jacobs Tour Down Under. Yes, and the house, Moraroo, is, as you go into that centre, is just on your right. It's still owned by Orlando, I think, but it's now used for private functions. Did any of the German women, the women who had German heritage, marry many English men? The ones I found were already married. There were a couple, and I can see the photograph, but I can't remember who it was, married German men, but that wasn't something I looked at, but it is a good point. That'll have to be my next PhD, I'm afraid. Yes. 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 My hunch is that in those early days that the German men married German women. I don't know, but I have no proof of that. But it's interesting. Yes, thank you.
How old was Anne when she came out?
21. She had her birthday on the boat, and she didn't have very kind things to say about the Googers.
Does that mean she's only 55?
Yes,
She died?
yes, she was quite young. Yes, in the vineyard. What was she doing at Mount Gambier? I think she was visiting a relative and died there. How many women are now registered in the Roseworthy wine courses? Yes, I wouldn't say big. I wouldn't use the word big influx. Pam Dunsford was one of the first women. In 1972 she was admitted, and her rooms were in the infectious diseases ward, which, you know, is quite appalling, isn't it? That's what, you know, they thought of her being there. Before that, there was a woman in the 1890s, a woman called Nora Herring, and Nora applied and was refused on the grounds of her sex. And it's interesting, I found, she thought, oh, you know, that, I'm going to get a vineyard anyway, which she did, and she built it, guess where? On the side of my old high school. I couldn't believe Seek of high school. But yes, there is an increasing number of women who are enrolled, but it would be interesting to see though if they finish their studies. So it is very difficult. There are some women gradually now who do more courses at Waite, and I think that Roseworthy is kind of winding down a bit. It isn't something I looked at, but when I interviewed several women winemakers, they said yes, there's much more of an interest, and occasionally we do see articles about them. Thank you.
A lot of interest.
Yes, Johannes Menger, he did live in a cave, and I got permission and went and had a look at it. To read, they're in that, copper plate handwriting, and some of it is illegible, but I ploughed through enough of it. He visited Anne quite frequently. From what it says in the diary, Mr. Menger came for dinner and we visited Mr. Menger and things like that. Any other questions or comments? Yes. Yes, it is a wine name. My husband's family's from Melbourne, and I think there are some distant relations, kind of, small twigs on the vine, but not the historian John Tolley, and not Ang Tolley, and I think there's a vet, and we're not related to any of those, but I'm not sure which ones we are. So, but there are some, yes. But that's not why I did the PhD either.
Julie, thank you very much. I think you have certainly chosen to study in a field which has had little or no attention. Your PhD is nearly finished, I understand. All the very best in finishing up that and the conferring of it in due course, but I think it's testimony to your groundbreaking work that you have already had the opportunity to speak at international conferences on the history of wine in France, I understand, and shortly at the conference to be held at the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Library here in Adelaide, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the future. You've obviously got a lot to say, you've researched it well, and I certainly hope that maybe through our journal you'll choose to publish a small part of that work, but maybe in the long run something larger will come out in the form of a work under your name which will do justice to a band of or group of professional women who've been overlooked. So I think by the number of questions and the fact that you're going to get more over supper, your speech has been very well received, and thank you. You're forgiven for the empty bottles.